The presses had not yet cooled. In the thin hours before dawn, when the city still smelled of smoke and river damp, the great hall of the tractor plant glowed like the belly of a waking beast. Electric arc lights threw white columns against steel ribs. Shadows pooled between machines, as if the machines themselves kept secret the long list of sins and salvations written into their gears. Men and women moved through the haze with a practiced carefulness, their faces streaked with dust and soot, their hands already stained from yesterday's toil. Somewhere deeper in the plant, the sound rose and fell like a tidal pulse. Hammers, presses, the ratcheting dance of wrenches, a steady roar of furnaces that seemed iron into shape. If one might name a heartbeat in that place, it would be the Foundry. Molten metal flowed in channels the way a city's blood must, diverted and poured into molds with a speed tempered by human hands. Sparks flew in fountains. Each spark was a tiny promise that a plate would be hardened, a casting would hold, a turret ring would sit true. They were promises that had to be kept, because outside the factory walls, the sky sometimes tore open with the sound of falling things, and the ground itself answered with tremors. Before the first blast furnace had been lit that morning, foremen checked lists and engineers bent over plans. Their notebooks smudged as if to prove that numbers could get dirty and still be right. Among them, an older man moved with the deliberate restraint of someone who had learned to measure hope in millimeters. He carried the steady, small authority of someone who trusted metals and men in equal measure. To the others, he was usually called simply Mikhail. At the drawing tables, he had the quiet of an old teacher. At the furnaces, he had the temper of a practiced smith. He knew every stubborn seam in the plant and had seen new production lines arrive with a mixture of suspicion and hunger. He knew the machine's moods and, sometimes, their limits. This was the Stalingrad tractor plant, the iron heart of a city that had once been famed for cultivating the land and had been remade by war. Tractors had been the plant's language. Now tanks were being coaxed out of that same grammar. The T-34, wide, angular, diesel-engined, with sloped armor that made bullets glance off like rain, arrived not only as a machine, but as an idea that altered the plant's pulse. For men and women who had once produced tractors and plows, to make a T-34 was to transform routine into urgency, to bend ordinary labor into the shape of survival. It required new tools, new rhythms, new forms of courage. Before the workday unfolded, a note of business had to be said to those who would watch and listen. If you are staying for this, consider subscribing and liking. It helps keep these stories of people and machines seen. Now, stay with the next hours. When the first whistle blew and the day began in earnest, the plant was already a map of tasks. Lines of steel plates arrived from rail cars, skewed and scraped from the long journey. Men in leather aprons unrolled them, holding them up to the light, feeling for buckles, cold spots, impurities. The stampers boomed as they cut rectangles into hull sides, and the press operators, many of them women whose hands had learned a new kind of firmness, guided the metal into dies the size of small houses. The dies, when released, sighed like organ pipes and left behind shapes that would become the backbone of a tank. Welding booths wintered each long hull section with bright seams that cooled into rigid geometry. A welder's torch was a painter's brush in that hall, adding the last strokes to rough sketches of war. Mikhail watched the assembly line's choreography from a catwalk that smelled of oil and hot iron, watching a sequence he had begun to know intimately: hull, turret ring, suspension, engine bay. But every successful sequence had been a negotiation with stubborn facts. Early in the war, the plant had attempted to replicate designs with makeshift tools and second-hand dies. Presses designed for plowshares were pressed, literally, into forming armored plates. Where the dies did not exist, men hammered plates in heated sheds, folding metal like paper until it took the sloped, angled form that would give the T-34 its defensive advantage. The innovations were not always elegant. They were grit and necessity. Sometimes an overnight brainstorm, someone bolting a modified gear onto an existing lathe, adapting a tractor craning rig into an engine hoist, would yield the right shape. Sometimes a part would fail, and a whole day's schedule would be lost. Failures were taught like lessons. When a turret ring cracked during testing, the sound that ran through the plant was not only of metal failing, but of something human and collective snapping. Plans, timetables, small illusions of control. Workers gathered to look, the way one looks at a fallen colleague. They learned in that silence to speak less of blame and more of repair. They adjusted pouring temperatures, reworked cast compositions with small additions of nickel or manganese when possible, and changed the timing of the tread hardening process. Each adjustment was a hypothesis. Each test run was a judgment rendered by fire and force. The plant's greatest constraint was not only technical, but elemental. The city was under assault. From certain vantage points, the horizon had been reduced to a smear of smoke and orange, the river a ribbon cut through ruin. Bombs came like punctuation marks, sometimes day, sometimes night. Air raid sirens had become a part of the plant's timing, their wail migrating from a prompt to an accompaniment. During the worst of the raids, workers were expected to seek shelter, but many returned as soon as the all-clear sounded, their hands itching to return to the tasks that might, they told each other, save families elsewhere. There were shifts that started at midnight, resumed at dawn, and stretched into a loop where sleep was a rumor. On one such night, when flares traced slow, lantern-like arcs over the city and searchlights combed the sky, a group of young mechanics gathered around a half-completed engine block. Sergei was 21, his jaw still soft, and his eyes had the quick, frightened curiosity of someone who had seen too much to be naive, but too little to be resigned. He wiped his gloves with the edge of his sleeve and joked, in a voice that tried to keep the air light, about the engines learning to breathe. Anna, who had learned welding in the machine shop because the men who taught her had been sent forward, only smiled. Her hands were steady in the dark because she had decided they would be. "Keep the bronzes at 90, Mikhail said to Sergei, his voice carrying the weight of experience rather than command. "If you overheat them, the rings will seize. If they seize, the engine is useless." Sergei nodded. He and Anna moved to check the bearings, while above them a dull thunder made the fixtures vibrate. The plant itself seemed to be listening, as though metal were a living thing that took in the city's sounds and set them into its own rhythm.
When the first concussion hit the eastern edge of town, far enough away that the building did not collapse, but close enough to rattle windows, the foreman paused, then continued, saying nothing about fear. At work, people held to the fiction that their hands could make destiny. The presence of military officers in civilian industry is often imagined as an encounter between two kinds of authority. But in that plant, it was less a confrontation than a pressure that wrapped around everyone like hot steam. A colonel who came to inspect spoke sharply about quotas and frontline needs. His papers had lists of numbers that never fully captured the texture of the things they measured. He demanded an output that seemed at times impossible, insisting that 300 tanks a month be achieved when supply lines failed to keep pace. The engineers answered with lists of impediments: lack of casting molds, shortages of sheet steel, delays in diesel engines. The colonel frowned and then measured success by a different metric: the map of war. "The men need armor," he said once, in that clipped way soldiers have, as if that were the only truth left. Yet the work, its small adjustments and stubborn experiments, was where real agency lived. Across factories and workshops, forms of improvisation became routine. When rubber for seals ran low, women in a nearby textile workshop cut and layered canvas in a sealant bath that would keep water and dust at bay.
When precision bearings were scarce, machinists ground older parts to match, fitting them with tolerances that would not have pleased a peacetime engineer, but would do in the moment of necessity. Supply chains were rerouted through makeshift rail yards. Metal was siphoned from non-essential equipment. Agricultural molds were cannibalized for the presses. Each substitution carried risk, increased wear, potential failure in the field. But this was a calculus the plant had learned to accept, the calculus of urgency. Technical breakthroughs in such a place rarely arrived as single brilliant leaps. They were composite: a new jig here, a reframed assembly step there, an adaptation of a welding technique from an airplane shop, the insistence of a single machinist to try a different heat treatment. There were times when a single insight radiated outward. Once, enduring a string of breakages in track pins, a technician suggested a shallow regrind to reduce stress concentrations, a small geometric change that immediately reduced failure in subsequent runs. The solution carried no glamour. It was geometry and patience. Another time, when castings were porously failing because of trapped gases, a pattern maker altered the venting channels on a whim, sending a steady stream of air through the mold that let bubbles escape before cooling. When someone in a far corner of the plant tried a new quench timing for hardened plates, the result was less brittle armor with the same mass, a tiny, vital victory. Those nuggets of progress gathered like grains along the line and eventually altered the plant's output. More tanks rolled out with fewer faults. Their camouflage mud dried at the edges. The suspension systems proved rough but resilient. Crews would later swear that the T-34 could endure conditions that might break other machines. For the workers, each finished tank bore the smell of the plant, a medley of oil, sweat, heated steel, and the smoke of burned rags. They saw in those tanks not only the machine silhouette, but also the outline of their labor. Nights of hunger eaten over bench tops, fingers nicked by grinding wheels, hands cupped around tea mugs cold as river water. When a completed tank left the plant, there was little ceremony. It would be pulled slowly across the yard by a team of men and guided onto a flat car.
Neighbors would gather sometimes because the sight of a tank, whole, finished, painted, was a rare moment of completion in a landscape of interruption. Children watched from doorways as the rail cars eased out under swollen skies. Many of those men and women would never see the tank again, nor would they witness the place of its first fire. They would only know that something of their labor had moved from under their hands to somewhere the maps called front. Reports of battlefield valor and disaster circled back to the plant in a language of telegrams and rumor.
The crew of one tank survived an ambush because the sloped armor deflected a shell. Across the city, other accounts said different tanks had buckled and failed under heavier assaults. Mikhail kept a map in his office with pins that marked production and pins that marked where tanks had been lost, where they had held, where whole platoons had disappeared into silence. He would tape letters from returning crews, coffee-stained, brief, sometimes simply names and the phrase "intact" to the back of a blueprint. The letters fed both pride and a private grief. Names did not always return in the same order they were written. The plant also bore witness to civilian loss. Housing near the factory became a thin, gray zone of ruin. People crowded into cellars with bread and a few possessions. The line between plant and city thinned. Workers took shelter with families in cramped basements and climbed back to keep machines running. When bombs struck hard enough, the plant's walls echoed with the sound of a city being unmade. Debris overlay the tracks and delayed shipments for days. Estimates of casualties in the wider conflict would later be argued in books and in the mouths of politicians, but in the factory, the cost was counted in the quiet absence of co-workers who did not return from air raids, in the empty bench spaces left behind, in the sudden stop of a skilled hand that would not resume the weld. The plant's ledger had columns that could not be balanced by statistics. Within that pressure, tensions arose between those who prioritized speed and those who insisted on quality. A foreman, furious at delays, might push the line harder, asking welders to accept less than ideal seams to keep quota. A young engineer might argue that a weak weld would ruin more lives than a missed deadline. Such debates played out in whispered corners and in the cold rooms of temporary offices. In these moments, ethical choices were not abstract. They were embodied in decisions over a coupling, a bolt, the thickness of a plate. The line workers who bore both the hands-on knowledge and the weight of possible consequences became the moral center by default. They understood, sometimes better than their superiors, that a shoddy weld was not an abstract defect, but a potential tomb. The plant's ledger had columns that could not be balanced by statistics. There were moments when the plant took an almost liturgical cast. At midday, a shift would end and another begin, and workers would stand in a line beneath dripping pipes to get a rationed cup of black tea. The line was an equalizer. Officers and apprentices both accepted the same tin cup. Conversation in that queue ran the gamut from technique to rumor to the small obsessions that keep people sane. Football scores from 2 years before, a cousin's wedding long postponed, a recipe for pickled cucumbers. Laughter sometimes escaped in bursts as the weight of the day found an outlet, but it always had a reserve, as if stored in a separate chamber.
One of the plant's most painful tests came during an intense stretch when enemy planes bombed with a new ferocity. Flames licked at residential blocks near the works, and the air filled with the metallic tang of burning wood and oil. On one of those nights, a shop building collapsed under the weight of falling masonry. 2 men were tracked, and the rescue team pulled them out with burns that the medics could not wholly treat. The plant closed for a day, and a silence more expansive than any enforced curfew settled on the entire hall. People moved slowly, touching the tools as if to reassure themselves that while the world might break around them, the machines could be coaxed back into life. They returned to work with faces drawn, with hands that trembled at times when the rhythm demanded steadiness. Out of necessity, the plant also became a school. Men and women who knew tractors taught others about armor form and weld technique, lessons in metallurgical temperaments that would previously have required years of apprenticeship. Instructional groups formed at breaks. Experienced press operators wrote shorthand notes on the backs of cigarette packs. The knowledge spread fast because the stakes were rooted in survival. Where a peacetime factory might hoard expertise, here knowledge was shared as lifeline. Beyond the walls of the plant, in the marshalling yards and at the docks, the T-34s that had passed through the plant's hands met with engines and ammunition from other factories. Logistics stitched them into formations, rail cars rattling under escort, convoys threading through roads torn by shelling. Men loaded tanks onto transshipment points with the same muscle they had used in preparing earth for spring planting years before. Soldiers assigned to those tanks carried names: farmers, ice cutters, students, people who had been swept into the war's current and now rode machines that had been made in sweat and fever. Their voices sometimes made it back to the plant. Short telegrams that read like cassoulet recipes, sparse, necessary, streaked with smoke. When the first word came that a battalion equipped with several of the plant's tanks held its ground in a counterattack, the air in the plant changed for a day. The sound was different, less grinding, more exhalation.
Men pinned a crude pennant on a column, and for once the pressman spared a joke and instead nodded with an almost solemn recognition. The colonel would later visit again, less fussy about quotas and more interested in the stories of the crews, because metrics mattered less than reports that moral could be held. Yet pride was tempered by caution. The plant had learned the unpredictable arithmetic of war. There were also quieter, more intimate acts of rebellion against despair. An old foreman arranged for letters to be smuggled into the city by railway for a group of seamstresses whose sisters were at the front. A welder would swap part of his ration for somebody else's, making sure a widow had enough flour. These small acts did not show up on production reports, but they altered the human ecology of the plant, binding people together in invisible ways. As months bled into hard seasons, the plant's techniques matured. Processes that had once been makeshift found their footing. The casting pits were redesigned to reduce inclusions. Welding protocols were standardized across bays. Inspection jigs were built so that a turret ring's tolerance could be checked in minutes rather than hours. Operators developed shorthand, checks, knocks, a small kiss on a part before it went under the press. Rituals that kept attention thinly spread across the grinding pace of assembly. The T-34s that left the yard acquired a kind of community provenance. They bore the fingerprints of 1,000 hands rather than the signature of a single genius.
But no machine, however well made, can be detached from the moral economy that builds it. Toward the end of a long, smoky day, Mikhail stood in the yard and listened to a group of young workers arguing about the future. One thought they were molds for a different century, a period of mechanization that would ease agriculture and rebuild houses after the war. Another argued that the very technologies being mastered then, heat treating, metallurgical alloys, precision machining, would also birth peacetime industries that might change lives for better or worse. Mikhail understood both. He had no illusions that the plant's labor was purely noble. He had seen both the ways technology can save and the ways it can enable terrible ends. Perhaps the plant's most lasting legacy would not be a patent or a blueprint, but the hidden curriculum of its work. The way people learn to make robust decisions under pressure, to share knowledge, to reconcile urgency with integrity. In later years, after factories were rebuilt and tractors again plowed fields, those lessons would ripple outward into peacetime industry. Engineers who had cut their teeth on wartime deadlines went on to design peacetime machinery with an eye for durability and simplicity. Metallurgists who had learned to coax alloy performance from limited resources taught others how to stretch materials without sacrificing safety.
There was a continuity of practice, a lineage that connected the furnace's glow to the quiet hum of post-war assembly lines. And yet, the memory was ambivalent. When peace finally settled like dust in the plant's rafters, people walked through the halls seeing ghosts in the shapes of equipment. There were tanks that would be scrapped. There were stories of valor that would be turned into slogans. The plant became a museum of absence as much as of production. Machines that had once been tools of survival, now relics that would sit, cold, instructing new generations in mechanics and the costs embedded in steel. In the end, the tractor plant stood as a testament not merely to manufacture, but to a certain moral architecture. The way collective ingenuity and relentless labor could bend the impossible into the possible, and the way that possibility always carried with it a ledger of human consequence. The T-34s that had rolled out under bombing did more than change maps. They bound to the city's identity the paradox of invention made under duress. To save and to destroy, to shelter and to strike, to forge life and to steal it into instruments whose futures would be written by decisions beyond the factory gates. When visitors years later walked through the refurbished halls, they would hear the echo of hammers like distant heartbeats. They would be told the story of how ordinary workshops leaned into extraordinary demand, how women lifted presses and men learned welding in shifts that erased day and night. They would be shown a sample of an old turret ring, pitted and repaired, and asked to imagine the hands that had coaxed it into being. Memory, after all, works by traces. The faint stain on a bench, the old bolt still fastened into a post, the low arch where a passage had been bricked up during the evacuation. Mikhail, when he was older and the plant had given way to different administrations and new names, would sometimes sit by a small window near the foundry. He would watch the river, now less thick with smoke, and think of the afternoons when the plant had seemed a crucible in the most literal sense, a place that tested metal and character together. He would remember the nights of air raid sirens, the men and women who had not come back, the small victories and the tragic costs. In his pocket he still kept an old heat-blued square of iron, worn by time, held like a relic.
He never imagined that the machines he helped form would ever be celebrated without the ugliness attached to them. But he carried, as all survivors do, a mixed inheritance. Admiration for the ingenuity that turned tanks into tanks, and the knowledge that those very machines also tightened the world's capacity for violence. To commemorate one without acknowledging the other would be to simplify a history that had been complicated by choices made in smoke and haste. Outside, the city had been rebuilt in many ways and abandoned in some corners.
Streets now bore new names, and older scars had been paved over. Houses that had sheltered workers' families still stood in varying states of care, and occasionally an old man would point out to a visiting grandchild the exact bench where he had bent his back for weeks on end. Museums curated the artifacts and sanitized the stories. Some plaques celebrated industrial might, others whispered about human cost. Historians argued with each other over the exact impact of production numbers and whether one factory's output had been a decisive factor in the campaign. For those who had lived through it, the memory resisted neat conclusions. The plant's tale resembles many such industrial epics, small improvisations folded into large-scale outcomes, moral questions never wholly resolved, a people transformed by necessity into the craftsmen of war. It is a story of ingenuity and of fatigue, of the slow building of competence and the sharp fractures of loss. It is, above all, a human story. Hands that learned a new vocabulary of metal and fire, eyes that watched the horizon for threats, hearts that beat in time with presses and furnaces, and, once in a while, let themselves be moved by the pride of a finished machine. In the quiet that followed Reconstruction, the plant would now sometimes host tours. School children would be led through the old assembly bays, their voices bouncing off the high roofs, and a guide would tell of the T-34s that once rolled out under the drumbeat of war. Visitors would be shown a diagram of the machine and told of its design virtues: sloped armor, a powerful diesel engine, simple maintenance. But beneath those technical explanations, the deeper lesson waited. One that the machines themselves could not teach, that technology is never neutral in a war. It can serve survival, it can also be enlisted for destruction. The choice of what it serves is human, and humans must always carry the burden of that choice. There is, finally, a strange tenderness in the idea that the tractor plant, built to ease fields, became for a time a forge of machines that would decide lives. The hands that guided metal into form did not imagine themselves as authors of history. They were simply doing what needed to be done. Yet history, in its slow, indifferent way, records them. The story is neither wholly noble nor wholly shameful. It is, like the metal they worked, tempered by heat and pressure into something that can be studied, admired, and also deeply questioned. And so the Foundry's echo continued, long after the sirens were turned into memory. A low, human rhythm that speaks of endurance, of the cost of victory, and of the ambiguity that lingers when industry and war conjoin. The tractors returned in time to fields, the T-34s were retired or memorialized, and the men and women who had bent iron under bombing assumed quietly different lives. They carried with them the particular knowledge of how to make, to mend, and to reckon with what one makes in times of desperate necessity. The city learned to remember without heroizing. The plant taught a lesson about the fragility and the resilience of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary tasks. Their shadow on the earth will remain, not only in scrap metal and rusted tracks, but in the habits of care and craft they passed on. Habits that built the post-war world even as they bore the marks of their violent origin. The tractor plant that mass-produced the T-34 under bombing thus stands as an emblem of human ingenuity, of shared sacrifice, and of the moral complexity of machines forged in the crucible of war. Lev found the place by habit more than by map. The gate stood where it had always stood, a squat arch of brick and wrought iron, softened by years of soot and ivy. Inside the courtyard, the air carried the same cold, metallic scent he had known since he was a boy. Oil and coal, a faint sweetness of hot metal cooled in the draft. Machines had moved on. The presses were silent, their teeth polished and draped in museum ropes. But the geometry of the halls, long, echoing, measured by pillars that kept their silence, had memory in its bones. He walked as if listening, his palm occasionally brushing the worn balustrade, as if to read a hidden script written in the dents and grease. Anna met him by the main bay where the T-34 stood propped on a low plinth, its dark silhouette softened by the museum lights. She had arranged for a quiet hour. As curator, she had learned to balance truth with the city's appetite for tidy storylines, manufacture, sacrifice, victory, return to peace. Her eyes were still young. On her desk there were letters and schedules, faded photographs of men in overalls, a child's drawing pinned beneath glass. Small things that made the archive less abstract. "You always choose the most inconvenient times to come," Anna said, but she smiled as she did. Lev shrugged. His jacket smelled faintly of soap and tobacco. His hands, even now, had the ghost of calluses. They moved around a tank. Children in school groups pointed at the sloped armor and asked the guides about engines. Their voices made the empty rafters sing. Anna's tour had a script, but she had given Lev permission to speak at the end if he wanted. He did. He did not want to be the center. He wanted only to set one small record straight. Lev cleared his throat. "They call it a machine," he said, but it answered to names. Men who sat inside it, men who died with their breath still tasting of fresh oil. They were not a statistic. A small hush gathered. The teacher at the back nudged a boy to listen. The children shifted, intrigued. He told them about the rhythm of the shop, the presses striking like a great patient heart, the line of conveyors like a spine, the smell of sweat and hot iron that clung to a man for days. Here, in the dim back room, history narrowed until it lay in the palm of an old man. Dmitri leaned back, the ledger open on his knee. "Have you ever told the museum everything? All the secret orders, the nights?" Lev's eyes went distant. He remembered names, not always with pride. He remembered evenings when a foreman came home with a photograph of a comrade killed on a distant step, and they sat in the kitchen and did not speak the word guilt. He remembered, too, spending a morning teaching his son to read while grease still burned under his nails. To him, truth was a heavy thing, necessary, but not always kind to those who bore it. "I told bits," he said.
You have to understand, boy, these things make some people proud and some people sick. After the war, we were told to move on, to plant, to marry, to build schools. The city wanted a story that healed. I did not think anyone would want an honest one. But there are pieces we keep. The choice to hide names was made to keep bread on tables. That is what I told myself. Dmitri's gaze sharpened. But bread, Lev, is not the only answer. There are names here. Some people would like to know why their fathers did not come home. Some would like the truth. Outside, down the avenue, a memorial committee was preparing the wording for a plaque to be placed beside the tank. The proposal had been civil in tone. For the courage of our workers and the ingenuity of our engineers. The city wanted a line about sacrifice and a line about industry returning to peace. There had been whispers, a widow who said that her husband's name had been left from the rolls, a veteran who did not want his unit reduced to statistics. The ledger's secret made the question more urgent. Whose story would be told when the metal cooled? Anna closed the ledger and slid it into the archival box. We will catalog this, she said. We will keep it safe, and we will decide how to use it with care. The town deserves to remember whole people, not slogans. Lev nodded, but his fingers curled around the edge of the box, as if to steady it. There was a moral arithmetic at play. How to balance the necessary elisions that had kept lives fed against the obligation to honor the absent. He had lived with that balance all his life, and it had left him both grateful and hollowed. That evening, as the museum emptied and the lights dimmed, Lev walked one last time around the T-34. He placed his palm on cold steel and let his forehead rest there for a moment. The metal was not forgiving, nor was it condemning. It held memory like a layered sediment, each addition a trace, each repair a scar. Out in the yard, a shadow moved, Dmitri carrying the ledger to his car, hesitating at the gate. He carried with him the small list of ghost workers, and with it the possibility of opening conversations the city had been avoiding. Lev watched him go.
He thought of the men at the presses, of the nights when a single decision had meant a half-world of consequence. He thought of his son, whose hands had become bakers' hands after the war, shaped by a different, quieter craft. He thought of the letter that had arrived from a tank commander, thanking them for a clamp that had kept his men alive. In the end, perhaps, histories were accumulations of such small mercies and small crimes. The ledger would make no judgments. It would only list names. What came after, what the family did with those names, what the city chose to inscribe on its stones, would be for a later hour. Dmitri paused at the gate and looked back at the plant. For a moment, he could imagine the presses like sleeping beasts waiting for the hand that would wake them. He thought of the museum's plaque and the careful language of memory committees, and he felt a determination gather inside him. To write the ledger into the larger story, to trace the crooked lines of necessity and conscience back to the men who had lived them. He did not know how the city would take it. He only knew that truth, once found, had a way of insisting. When he opened the ledger again in his small flat that night, by the light of a lampshade and a cheap kettle on a ring, the names looked like a map.
Each entry led somewhere, to a family, to a grave, to a field that had been tilled by hands that also knew the press. He began to copy them down, not as an accusation, but as an offering. Outside, the river moved in its old channel, and lights reversed themselves on water like fragments of the past. The city, in its slow and human way, turned toward decisions it had been deferring. People who had once bent metal and then bent to other lives would be asked to remember more precisely than they had before. Some would be ready, some would not. And inside the museum, the T-34 kept its mute counsel, a machine that had been both a savior and an instrument, waiting to be read with all the care history demanded. The ledger, the letter, the names, these were not tidy objects. They refused the convenience of single meanings. They would force the town to contend with its own complexity, and in doing so might teach a new generation the old lesson Lev had learned across a lifetime, that making is never only a craft, and remembering is never only a comfort. Dmitri leaned over his notes and, by the dim lamp, began to trace a line between an asterisk in the ledger and a name on a photograph found in an indexed folder. The line was thin, tentative. It might, he thought, pull a thread that led to other threads and to other rooms in the museum where the truth waited, folded into the paper and metal of ordinary lives. He did not yet know what the whole tapestry would look like, for now it was enough to begin unfolding it. The plant's echo, as Lev had said, would not be silenced by tidy plaques.
It would speak in tongues of ledger ink and folded letters, and those who listened would have to learn how to hear without simple answers. He folded the traced line back into the ledger, and, before he meant to, found himself walking toward the old quarter, where the houses leaned on their stories like tired people on a fence. The name he had marked, Korovin, led him to a green door with peeling paint and the string of geraniums in a chipped pot. He knocked, waited, and heard the slow scuff of slippers. An elderly woman opened a moment later, her face a mop of years. When he said the name, she blinked, then smiled as if a light had been set by a hand she once knew. Inside, the apartment smelled of yeast and dill. There were plates drying on a rack and a single cracked photograph on the mantel. 3 men in overalls, shoulders brushed together, laughing at something off camera. Dmitri spoke in the halting, careful way of someone carrying another's memory. He told her about the ledger, about the press, about a clamp and a letter that had kept a tank alive. She listened without astonishment. The town had always kept one foot in the past. When he showed her the name, her hands trembled as if touching a coin too thin to spend. She produced a small packet of brittle paper, receipts, a service card, a folded scrap where someone had once penciled a bicycle frame number. Her son, she said, had been at the plant. He had come home with oil on his nails and something in his eyes that never left. They spoke until the light changed in the window, and Dmitri realized he had been a stranger until then.
He left with a handful of small things, a promise to look up an address, a recipe scrawled on the back of a receipt, a photograph she said he could copy. On the stair, he paused and thought of Lev by the tank, of how history softened under a palm. In the museum, the T-34 waited, patient and immense. The ledger would not finish itself. But the lines Dmitri drew that night had begun to cross, and the cross-hatching would call others to sit at the same table and reckon. He walked home with the photograph folded against his chest, feeling that the plant's echo had finally found an ear.